First glimpse of the enemy. June 12, 1944. Somewhere near Saint-Lô, Normandy, France. The morning mist hung low over the war-torn fields, clinging to the jagged remnants of hedgerows like a ghostly veil. Sergeant Friedrich Weber squinted through the fog, gripping the worn leather of his Mauser rifle as the distant rumble grew steadily louder. It wasn't the familiar thunder of artillery or the rattle of half-tracks. No, this was something else entirely. A mechanical growl that seemed too deep, too heavy to belong to any vehicle they had faced before. Corporal Dieter Hoffmann cursed under his breath, adjusting his binoculars. Through the haze, the silhouettes emerged. Massive, boxy forms, steel beasts, advancing steadily, their tracks chewing through mud with unrelenting purpose. The men froze, eyes wide, hearts hammering in unison. These were the American M4 Shermans, but to Weber and his men they looked like armored fortresses on tracks, impossibly large and almost surreal in their scale. The Americans, they built these by the hundreds? Hoffman whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. Around him, the squad of 12 men shuffled nervously, instinctively pressing themselves against the crumbling walls of a farmhouse. A Sherman's gun barrel swiveled, catching a beam of morning sunlight, and the reflection glinted like a predator's eye. It was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The first shells hit nearby hedgerows, sending sprays of earth and debris into the mist. Weber felt the vibration through the soles of his boots, the air thick with smoke, oil, and the sharp tang of fear. He knew instantly that these weren't tanks built for parades or symbolic displays. Every bolt, every plate screamed industrial power, an unrelenting statement from a nation capable of producing steel leviathans at a pace Germany could barely match. A young private, barely 19, stumbled backward, nearly falling into a trench. I've never seen anything like this," he stammered. His words dissolved in the roar of engines, each Sherman seemingly indifferent to the landscape, crushing hedgerows, splintering trees, and flattening defensive positions with methodical precision. Weber's eyes darted to the American crews atop their machines. They were calm, almost casual, waving rifles and shouting orders over the roar. Their demeanor, so composed in the chaos, added to the horror. These weren't desperate soldiers, these were operators of a mechanized juggernaut, each tank a small fortress with a lethal punch. For the Germans, the encounter shattered expectations. Up until now, intelligence had painted the Americans as industrious, yes, but their tanks were underestimated. The rumors of Sherman hordes had been dismissed in mess halls and officer briefings as exaggeration, almost propaganda. But now, seeing them tear across Normandy fields, Weber realized that reality was far worse than any report. The Americans had mastered not just quantity, but design, using armor layout and firepower in ways that made German panzer crews question everything they knew about armored warfare. Every Sherman that rolled past seemed to mock their disbelief. The rumble, the sheer size, and the relentless advance drove a new understanding into the hearts of Weber's squad. This was industrial warfare incarnate. The war had shifted from battles fought with skill and tactics alone to contests of production, scale, and steel. And the Germans were now facing the consequences firsthand.
First clash at the hedgerows. June 13, 1944. The sun barely pierced the thick morning fog, casting a pale light over the twisted, muddy terrain of Normandy. Sergeant Weber's squad crouched behind the shattered remnants of a stone wall, their breath visible in the cold air, hearts pounding with anticipation. The distant rumble of Sherman engines had grown into a chorus of steel and fire, punctuated by the sharp crack of rifle shots and the booming echoes of 75mm shells. From their vantage point, the Americans were advancing in coordinated waves, each Sherman seemingly aware of the other's position, their armor glinting in the sporadic sunlight. Private Heinrich Müller whispered a prayer, gripping his MG-42 like a lifeline. They are unstoppable," he muttered. His words were cut short as the first Sherman rolled into the clearing, its treads devouring mud and debris, grinding down the familiar hedgerows that had served as natural German fortifications for months. Weber and Hoffman exchanged a glance, silently acknowledging the terrifying truth. Hedgerows, once thought to be impenetrable, offered no protection. A Sherman 75mm gun fired a warning shot that obliterated a nearby wall, sending bricks and splinters flying like shrapnel. The squad dove instinctively to the ground, ears ringing from the explosion. Smoke and dust filled the air, stinging their eyes, and the smell of burning earth and scorched metal made their stomachs churn. Corporal Hoffman peered through a slit in the wall. "They're not just big, they're smart. Look at how they move, covering each other, breaking through everything in their path." The squad watched, paralyzed with awe and fear, as the Sherman crews coordinated with precision. Machine guns raked over the ground ahead, suppressing any German positions, while other tanks methodically smashed through defensive barriers, crushing obstacles as though they were mere twigs. Private Müller's hand shook as he reloaded his rifle. Do we even stand a chance?" His voice trembled. Sergeant Weber's jaw tightened, eyes scanning the advancing behemoths. "We fight, but we survive only if we adapt. These tanks are more than steel. They're a symbol of what we're up against. Remember that." A sudden flash lit up the hedgerow ahead. A Sherman's gun fired, and the impact threw debris high into the air. The ground quaked beneath them, shaking their makeshift cover. Soldiers scattered, bullets whistling past, tearing through the morning silence. Weber's squad returned fire with whatever they could muster: Panzerfausts, rifles, and machine guns, but the shells bounced harmlessly off the Sherman's armor. The realization hit with gut-wrenching clarity. Standard German infantry weapons were nearly useless against this new wave of American engineering. The battle dragged on in a relentless rhythm of noise and chaos. Every tank that rolled forward seemed impervious, a juggernaut moving in eerie synchronicity. Weber saw one Sherman halt briefly, its commander atop the turret scanning the field, then move on with unwavering determination. The Germans began to understand the full scope of what they were facing. Not just tanks, but an industrial machine unleashed with terrifying efficiency. By noon, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the full scale of destruction. Hedgerows that had once provided cover were now splintered ruins. Craters from artillery and tank fire pocked the landscape. Weber's squad regrouped behind the shattered wall, counting losses and taking stock of their dwindling ammunition. The sight of their comrades lying motionless amid the mud and twisted metal sent chills down their spines. Hoffman's voice was barely audible. "We underestimated them, and we paid for it." Weber nodded grimly, staring at the advancing line of Shermans, each seemingly larger and more unstoppable than the last. Normandy had become a proving ground for America's industrial might, and the Germans were learning, in the harshest way possible, that size, numbers, and coordination could overcome even the most determined resistance.
The realization of industrial might. June 14, 1944. Late afternoon, just outside the shattered village of Carentan. The sun hung low, casting long shadows over fields pockmarked with craters and splintered hedgerows. Sergeant Weber wiped mud from his uniform, his hands trembling, not from fatigue, but from the images burned into his mind. The Shermans hadn't just rolled through their defenses, they had rewritten the rules of engagement entirely. Across the fields, Corporal Hoffman observed the American tanks from a broken fence line. "We thought our panzers were unstoppable," he muttered bitterly, his eyes tracking the slow, deliberate advance of the Sherman platoons. "But this is something else. They're everywhere." Hoffman's wants were no exaggeration. Even with limited intelligence, Weber could see it. American tanks weren't isolated units. They came in waves, backed by trucks, engineers, and supply convoys that seemed to appear as if from nowhere. Every destroyed Sherman was quickly replaced. Every breach they created was immediately exploited. Weber's mind flashed back to the War Council in Paris months earlier. German officers had laughed at reports of American mass production, dismissing it as overstatement. "Steel and numbers can't win a war," they had claimed. But standing in the churned mud of Normandy, amidst the groans of destroyed hedgerows and the acrid smell of burning vehicles, Weber realized that theory had been a fatal mistake. American industry was a force of nature, relentless, inexhaustible, and terrifyingly efficient. The squad moved cautiously through the ruins of Carentan. Civilians, when they could be seen, huddled in doorways, faces pale, eyes wide with fear. Sherman tanks rumbled past, engines growling, their silhouettes casting enormous shadows over the village. Each tank carried a crew of 5, a commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver, all working in seamless coordination. Their discipline and composure under fire only added to the impression that these machines were extensions of an unstoppable human and industrial synergy. Private Mueller lagged behind, staring at a Sherman's treads as they crushed what little remained of a hedgerow. "How do you fight something that doesn't stop?" he asked, voice trembling. Weber gritted his teeth. "We adapt, or we die. That's all we can do." But even he could not hide the creeping doubt. The German army had trained for maneuver and skill, but the Americans were demonstrating that sheer production, design, and coordinated tactics could overwhelm any prepared position. By evening, the Germans had established a temporary fallback line behind the village outskirts. Weber took stock of his squad, exhausted, shaken, but alive. The numbers told a story almost as frightening as the tanks themselves. Every Sherman destroyed was replaced within days. Every defensive tactic had to be reconsidered. The Americans weren't just fighting, they were demonstrating the full might of their industrial engine, and the Germans were struggling to keep up. Weber's eyes followed the last Sherman of the day as it disappeared into the horizon, smoke curling from its exhaust. In that moment, a bitter understanding settled over him. This war was no longer just about skill or courage. It was about production, logistics, and the unrelenting capacity to replace what was lost. The Americans had turned industry into a weapon as lethal as any panzer, and the battlefield of Normandy was now a testament to their staggering advantage. As night fell, Weber lit a small cigarette, the glow briefly illuminating his weary face. The Shermans were gone for now, but their shadow remained, etched into every hedgerow and field they had crushed. Tomorrow they would return, and the Germans would have to face them again. And this time, Weber knew, it wouldn't just be about fighting tanks, it would be about surviving the weight of a nation's industrial might.
The Battle of Attrition. June 15th, 1944. Dawn broke over the rolling fields near Saint-Lô, Normandy. Mist still clung stubbornly to the craters and splintered hedgerows, and the acrid smell of burnt metal lingered in the air. Sergeant Weber's squad was already awake, crouched in shallow foxholes, scanning the horizon for the familiar rumble that had come to dominate their nightmares. It wasn't long before the first echoes of engines rolled across the fields. The Shermans were advancing again, dozens this time, forming a coordinated line that seemed to stretch endlessly across the scarred landscape. Each tank moved with precision, tracks tearing through mud as if the earth itself had no power to resist them. The Germans, armed with Panzerfausts, Mausers, and limited artillery, prepared for what would soon become a brutal trial of endurance. Corporal Hoffmann gritted his teeth, adjusting his binoculars to track the advancing machines. Every day they push forward with more tanks than we can count, he muttered, a mix of awe and despair in his voice. Private Müller, shivering in the morning chill, peered over the edge of the foxhole. How do they do it? Where do they get all of these monsters? Weber knew the answer, though it offered little comfort. America produces them like bread, every factory pumping out steel, every ship bringing supplies. We're fighting a tide we cannot stop, only slow. He glanced at his men, their faces pale but resolute. But we fight anyway. We survive anyway. That's all we can do. The first engagement began with a deafening roar. Shells flew, hedgerows shattered, and trees splintered like matchsticks under the relentless fire. The Shermans didn't simply charge, they coordinated. Some advanced while others covered flanks. Machine guns raked the fields, forcing the Germans into cover, while larger guns obliterated defensive positions. Each explosion sent tremors through the earth, dust and smoke filling the air, turning visibility into a haze of chaos. Weber's squad fired what they could, striking tanks with Panzerfausts whenever an opportunity arose. Occasionally, one Sherman would falter, smoke curling from its turret, but within hours another took its place. The realization sank in. This was attrition on an industrial scale. Every loss the Americans suffered was almost meaningless, quickly replaced by the staggering output of their factories. By late afternoon, the Germans were in retreat, forming new lines behind wrecked villages and shattered fields. Weber took a moment to tally the damage. Half of his squad had been wounded or killed, yet the Americans pressed relentlessly forward, seemingly unconcerned with casualties. Hoffmann's voice broke the silence. We can't match them in numbers, not anymore. Not with our weapons, not with our men. Weber nodded grimly, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The battle was no longer just tactical. It was a war of production, logistics, and an inexhaustible resolve. As dusk fell, the Sherman engines faded into the distance, leaving a battlefield littered with twisted steel, craters, and the silent bodies of men who had faced overwhelming odds. Weber lit a cigarette, inhaling the smoke as he surveyed the devastation. This is what industrial warfare looks like, a tide of steel that never ends, and we're caught in its path. The squad huddled together that night, exhausted but alive. They had survived, but the memory of the Sherman advance, the rumble, the firepower, the sheer size would haunt them forever. Normandy had become a crucible, testing not just courage or tactics, but the very endurance of the human spirit in the face of a seemingly unstoppable enemy. Lessons learned and the aftermath. June 16, 1944. The morning light revealed a battlefield transformed. Craters scarred the earth, hedgerows lay in splintered ruin, and the skeletal remains of vehicles, both German and American, spoke silently of the chaos that had passed. Sergeant Weber and his squad moved cautiously through the mud, eyes scanning for any remaining threats. Each step was heavy with exhaustion, but also with a grim understanding of the scale of what they had faced. Weber paused near a shattered Sherman, its turret twisted at an impossible angle. He traced the outline of the crew's compartment with his eyes, noting the efficient design that had made it such a formidable opponent. Every detail,
Armor sloped, firepower concentrated, mobility maintained, he muttered. This isn't just a tank. It's a machine built to dominate. Hoffman knelt beside him, wiping grime from his face. We underestimated them. Not just their tanks, but their entire approach to war. They build, they replace, they adapt, endlessly. The squad gathered in the ruins of a farmhouse for a brief respite. Around them, other German units regrouped, sharing stories of encounters with the Sherman juggernauts. The common thread was unmistakable, awe mixed with fear. The Americans' industrial scale had not only supplied a vast number of tanks, but had allowed them to integrate infantry, artillery, and air support in a way that created a coordinated, overwhelming force. Sergeant Mueller, still trembling from the previous day's encounters, asked the question on every soldier's mind. How do we fight against something like that? How do we stop it? Weber's response was measured, though tinged with the hard realism of experience. We adopt. We use what we know: terrain, ambushes, clever tactics. But understand this: numbers alone won't save us. The Americans have turned production into a weapon. They will always have more tanks, more guns, more men if needed. Fighting them is no longer about bravery alone. It is about survival and strategy. As the day wore on, reports filtered in from other sectors of Normandy. Similar scenes played out across the region: German positions shattered, towns overrun, and the relentless advance of Shermans leaving destruction in their wake. The realization was universal and chilling. The battlefield had shifted. The Germans were no longer merely contending with a capable enemy. They were facing the full might of a nation's industrial power. Weber's squad moved toward a defensive position overlooking a valley, their movements quiet but purposeful. The lessons of the past 3 days had been harsh. The Sherman's size and armor made them nearly impervious to standard infantry weapons. Their speed and coordination rendered conventional tactics less effective, and their numbers ensured that losses were quickly replaced. Every German soldier now understood that victory required more than courage or skill. It demanded adaptation, ingenuity, and a recognition of the enemy's overwhelming production capacity. As night fell over Normandy, Weber lit a cigarette, staring at the distant horizon where the glow of American campfires marked the continued presence of the Shermans. The battle was far from over. But the Germans had learned a crucial lesson. In the modern war, steel and industry could be as deadly as strategy and courage. And in the fields of Normandy, that lesson had been written in fire, mud, and the unrelenting rumble of tanks that refused to be stopped.
Reflection and historical perspective. June 17, 1944. The skies above Normandy were overcast, a muted gray that mirrored the mood among the German ranks. Sergeant Weber walked slowly along the shattered road leading from the village of Carentan, his boots sinking into the mud left by countless Sherman treads. Each footprint felt heavy, burdened not only with exhaustion, but with the dawning realization of the scale of the enemy they faced. Weber paused to look at the horizon, where the silhouettes of tanks, still distant but unmistakable, marked the unceasing advance of the American forces. He thought back to the first day he had seen them, how the size, the power, and the coordination of the Shermans had frozen him in disbelief. It had been more than shock. It had been an awakening. The German army had underestimated not just the engineering, but the industrial might behind these machines. Corporal Hoffman joined him, tossing a spent cartridge into the mud. "We thought the Panzer was supreme," he said quietly, voice tinged with regret. "We thought our tactics, our training, our courage, that it would be enough." Weber shook his head. "It was never enough. We were fighting a war of production. Steel, factories, and logistics, that's what they wielded as weapons. and here on these fields we saw it in action. The men moved through the remnants of the battlefield, noting the shattered hedgerows, the twisted hulls of tanks, and the lifeless forms of soldiers caught in the relentless surge. Each scene told the same story. The Shermans were more than weapons. They were symbols of an industrial juggernaut capable of replacing losses faster than the Germans could inflict them. Every destroyed tank, every fallen soldier seemed almost irrelevant in the face of that unstoppable force. Weber thought of the young privates under his command, some of whom had seen their first combat only days before. The lessons they had learned were harsh. Size and number mattered as much as skill, and industrial efficiency could dictate the outcome of battles in ways that strategy alone could not. For the German soldiers, Normandy had become a school of hard truths, where every encounter with the Sherman reinforced the staggering gap between perception and reality. As evening fell, Weber and Hoffman found themselves atop a small rise overlooking the valley below. The tanks were gone for now, but the battlefield bore their imprint, the churned earth, the broken hedgerows, and the silence that followed the roar of engines. Weber exhaled smoke into the cool air and reflected on what history would record. The encounter with the Shermans was not merely a battle, it was a revelation. It showcased how industrial capacity, innovative design, and relentless production had become decisive weapons of modern warfare. The soldiers would carry these memories for the rest of their lives. The shock of seeing the massive tanks, the terror of their unstoppable advance, and the lesson that courage alone could not overcome a nation's full industrial might. For the Germans in Normandy, the M4 Shermans were more than machines. They were a turning point, a tangible demonstration of how the tide of war could be shifted not just by strategy, but by the power of production, coordination, and relentless human ingenuity. And as the first stars appeared over the horizon, Weber knew one truth above all. In the era of industrial warfare, survival required respect for the enemy's scale as much as skill on the battlefield. The Sherman was not just a tank, it was the embodiment of a nation's ability to wage war, and Normandy proved that in the harshest, most unforgettable way.